Alrighty, so in today's video, I want to talk about the Raspberry Pi 5. So before I get started, I do want to mention that nothing in this video that I'm saying is going to happen for sure. These are just my thoughts and what I think the Raspberry Pi 5 is going to be like and when it's going to be released. So we're going to be taking a look at the older versions, the release dates, so we're going to kind of be guessing when it will be released and what kind of specs it's going to have. So to get started right here, I'm actually just going to look at the older Raspberry Pi models, and we're going to decide what date I think the Raspberry Pi 5 is going to be released on. So right here we have the first Raspberry Pi. The first one was the Model B. It had 256 megabytes of memory, so it was a really not powerful board. And it was released in 2012. And then right here we have the Model A 2013. And then B plus 2014, and we have A plus in 2014. So there was a 1-year difference between these two, and then these ones were both released in the same day. Year, I mean. We have Raspberry Pi 2. There's just one version of this one. It was released in 2015, so 1 year after the A plus. Then we have the two Raspberry Pi Zeros. The first one was released in 2015. The next one, which was a big bit of an upgrade, it was 2017. And that was, again, this was 2 years later. This was just 1 year later than the Raspberry Pi 2. But the Raspberry Pi Zero was kind of something different than the other Raspberry Pis, so it doesn't fit into those release dates exactly. And then if we look right here, we have the Raspberry Pi 3. The first Model B was released in 2016. And that was just the standard normal one. I actually own that one. And then we have the A plus, which was released in 2018. And then we have the B plus, which was also released in 2018. So there was a 1 year difference right here from the Raspberry Pi Zero to the Raspberry Pi 3 B plus. And those ones are actually a bit of an upgrade over the B, but they're not a huge upgrade, honestly. And then right here, 1 year after the Raspberry Pi 3 B plus, we saw the Raspberry Pi 4 Model B with 1, 2, and 4 gigs of RAM was released in 2019. So that was actually a pretty cool thing to see. It happened 1 year after the B plus. So as you might see, we're kind of going like every year they're releasing a new thing. Like the Raspberry Pi 3 B was in 2016. There was a whole 2 year difference between the B plus, but it's not that far. So we have the 2019, and then we actually got the 8 gigabyte just last year, so that would have been 2020 was when the 8 gigs was released. And then we have the Raspberry Pi 400, which you might have heard of, which was actually not long ago released at the end of 2020. So we have that. It's 1 year difference than the Raspberry Pi 4 Model B. And then we have the Raspberry Pi Pico, which, as you might have heard of, it's not a full Raspberry Pi. It's more for projects. It's towards like an Arduino type of thing. So I'm not actually going to put that one, consider in the same order. But if we look at these things, you see we have the B in 2019, Raspberry Pi 400 in 2020. Do you think the Raspberry Pi 5 is going to come out in 2021? Well, my honest thoughts, I do not think it's going to come out. I am guessing that the Raspberry Pi 5 will come out in 2022 because they've been releasing a lot of stuff this year. Last year, the 8 gigs, the 400, the Raspberry Pi Pico. So I just think, if you look at their year release dates, I feel like it is going to come out in 2022 rather than 2021. It is kind of a disappointment, but it's not a huge deal, and it will be cool to see what we have on that board. So these are just the different versions. We'll talk about what I think it's going to look like, what it's going to perform like in a minute. Yeah, so you see the price models right here. The first Raspberry Pi was only, RPI 1 Model B was $35. So it's always been a really nice and cheap board to buy. The most expensive Raspberry Pi there is the 400, which is at $70. Still, for the thing you're getting for the performance, it's actually a great deal. And if you don't want the whole thing, you can just go and buy the Raspberry Pi 4 Model B with 4 gigs of RAM, and it is not that expensive. So those are the price points. I feel like still the price is going to have to be under $100. Because if you think about it, the Raspberry Pis have always been this thing that they're these cheap, low power computers. So I feel like it's gonna have to stay like that for it to be popular. If they make a whole new thing and it's like $200, they're not gonna get as many people. And there might be better performance, but it's gonna lose what the Raspberry Pi are like. If we look at this Raspberry Pi 4 image right here, we see that we have two USB 3.0 ports and two 2.0 ports. What I'm suspecting is they're going to take these USB 2.0 ports off on the Pi 5. They'll probably slap on two more USB 3.0 ports because those are the future, those are the best. And the audio, I would suspect it's going to stay the same. That I'm not sure. We have two micro HDMI ports, which some people like, some people don't. They want the old big one. But I feel like they're not going to downgrade. They're going to stick with both of those. Actually, one of them is 60 Hertz, one of them is 30 Hertz, but I suspect that they might upgrade both of them to 60 Hertz. That might be a suggestion. I don't know. USB-C. USB-C will probably stay. USB-C is used a lot. Wi-Fi. There might be a Wi-Fi upgrade. So, if we talk about the CPU, I feel like because the Raspberry Pi Pico was the first board that Raspberry Pi Foundation released with a custom-made processor. They kind of followed what Apple did, where they made their own M1. Well, the Raspberry Pi Foundation made their own processing unit for the Raspberry Pi Pico. So this is something I'm actually pretty excited about, that the Raspberry Pi 5 might include its own custom processor. That would be really cool to see what they can accomplish with that. So I don't know, they might do it, they might not, but that would be a pretty awesome thing to see on a new Raspberry Pi 5 because it would be really well optimized and made especially for the Raspberry Pi 5. So right here we see 8 gigs of RAM. I bet they won't go under 8 gigs of RAM in the Raspberry Pi 5. They could add 16 gigs of RAM for some people who want to do crazy stuff, like servers or different stuff like that. 16 gigs of RAM might be a sweet spot that they would want to hit. But for most people, I would say 8 gigs of RAM, even on the Raspberry Pi 5, is going to be what most people are going to have. And that's about it for what I think about the specs. They might change the board design a bit, change some stuff around. Gigabit Ethernet, I'll bet the gigabit's going to stay the same. But I'm most excited to see what they're going to do with that processor. And if we can have a better GPU, that is going to improve so many things. Because as you might know, the Raspberry Pi 4 honestly does not have the best GPU. Graphics processing unit. It just struggles, and for gameplay, a new GPU would be amazing. Also for emulation, it would improve stuff so much. And yeah, so that would be a really cool thing to see if they can give us a powerful processor plus a powerful graphics card. One more thing to talk about is video playback. The Raspberry Pi 4 in terms of video playback is still not very developed. It can do 720p, awesome. 1080, you're kind of getting like it's freezing a lot and it's not that great. You get to 1440, it's a no-go. So if I watch videos on my Pi, it's always 720 for the best performance. So I would like to see some better optimizations on the Raspberry Pi 5 running Raspberry Pi OS to get that sweet 1080p, maybe even 1440p video playback. That would be something that I feel like should be required if they do release a new one. And yeah, that's what I would want to see on the new Raspberry Pi 5. Some better optimizations, better graphics acceleration in operating systems. Because tons of operating systems run on the Raspberry Pi 4, there is just no GPU acceleration, which just makes the system slow, unusable, and not that user-friendly. So that would be some of my things I like to see on this new thing. And yeah, so that we do need to see some of those things on the Raspberry Pi 5, and I'm sure that they will release that. But I do feel like the price will be a bit higher, most likely, because if you look at comments, most people are willing to pay a bit more for better performance. Like if the 8 gig is, I don't remember, it's like $70 maybe, the 4 gigs is like 50. People are willing to pay that $20 more just to get the 8 gigs. Even if they don't need it, they just want to know they can have the best they have. So I bet people Raspberry Pi Foundation and the Raspberry Pi it's not the best single board computer. There's better ones on the market. It's the most used one because it has an awesome community. Their developers are awesome, and it's just a super nice board to be able to play around with. And there's tons of docs about it. There's a whole big community that's super kind and helpful, and that's why I just love it. And yeah, so the Raspberry Pi 5 could be a huge jump for the Raspberry Pi Foundation if they do add this new custom processing unit. But if they don't, it could still be a huge jump. I mean, we don't know what the future is going to hold. But if we do see anything new like this, it will be amazing and I will be happy. I'll be buying it the day it releases. And as you know, the Raspberry Pi Foundation's delivery is super quick. They come so fast. It's just amazing. So yeah, I like to see Raspberry Pi OS run extremely well on the Raspberry Pi 5 and maybe some other official operating systems. Like it'd be good to see Manjaro. I bet the Manjaro ARM team will pull some awesome stuff off with that. Ubuntu probably will be pretty well. So these are just some of my hopes for the new Raspberry Pi 5 that I suspect will be released in 2021. As I said at the beginning of the video, I do not know if anything of these things will be true or not, but these are just my hopes, and I hope they come true. So yeah, if you know anything about the Raspberry Pi 5, or want to ask me anything, or just want to comment about it, let me know down below in the comments, and we can see what we figure it out. So this video was actually pretty fun to make, to talk about my ideas and what I think is going to happen. So thanks for watching.